I'm Diana Pasulka. I am a professor of religious studies at the University of North Carolina in Wilmington. I've been at that university for 21 years, and I have done a lot of things there. I was there as an ABD, and now I'm a full professor. I'm former chair of the department there, and I've done administrative work. So I've done a lot in the academy from both sides. Anyway, I started studying impossible things, I guess you could say, actually my whole life, but the method changed in 2012. And I wrote a book about UFOs, and now I study that. And I'll be talking tonight about that as well. So I'd like to introduce the panelists. You all know Dr. Jeff Kripal. In fact, part of my change into studying the impossible happened one weekend when I read Authors of the Impossible, John Mack's abduction, and then I visited a conference of UFO experiencers in my town. And if that's not going to change your brain, I don't know what would. So that did, and I had already heard of Jeff. I read Colley's Child in grad school. I was already a fan, and that, of course, clinched it for me. So I started to look into his methods, and even worked with Jeff at the Esalen Center for Theory and Research. So Jeff is, you know who he is. He's been chair. He's been a professor as long as me, maybe even longer. And he's been doing this work for a long time. And he's at the forefront in religious studies, and also his work bleeds into other disciplines as well, as does this work. So that's Jeff. I'd like to introduce Dr. Joseph Laycock. He's an associate professor at Texas State University, and I've heard of his work forever. It seems we have a lot of intersections. My training was in history of Catholicism, and focusing on Marian apparitions, and he wrote a book about Veronica Lucan. That was his dissertation. She had Marian apparitions, and she was a Catholic seer, and a lot of really strange things happened around her. And I believe we shared the same editor, right, Cynthia?
Yeah, Cynthia, who just retired.
Yeah, Cynthia Reed at Oxford University Press, a huge advocate of the work that we do. So it was sad when she retired. And then I'd like to introduce Natasha Mikles, again from Texas State University, and an assistant professor whose specialization is in Tibetan and Chinese religions. And she has some really interesting questions that I've read, she's sent to me. And I think we're going to start off with some of those questions because they're really good. But she's focusing on how a lot of knowledges are just not incorporated into the academy because they come from like women or people who are poor or people of color, things like that. And I think that that's a pretty important, that's central to, I think, what we should be talking about here. We also have Wendy Lochner here, and she's an editor, which is really great because I think all of us want to know what editors think because we all write books. So Wendy's from Columbia University Press, and part of what she does is she's the editor for books about religion.
And philosophy, yes.
And philosophy. Okay, great. Well, that covers a lot of people here. And I'd also like to make this point, too, because all of us here on this panel, we're not scientists. We're actually in anthropology or religious studies. And I think the questions that have to do with the impossible and questions about the impossible they're not the same with respect to those two disciplines. And one of the reasons is that people in my field, especially during graduate school, I went to Syracuse University, which is kind of like a mini Rice, right? So the religion department, it was very open to the kinds of questions that I was asking. But the kinds of ways that I was taught to, this was back in the day, okay, but I was taught to bracket my belief when I would study things of the impossible. And that might still be the case. I'm sure it's not in your department, but things like that. So we had frameworks for studying these types of things. And anthropology does too. I know a lot of anthropologists. Hussein actually was supposed to be here. Ali Agrama, you probably know his work. It's amazing. And so he's an anthropologist, and I have a lot of correspondence with anthropologists, and we have a similar way of approaching impossible things. What I don't want to make this a joke, but prior to getting tenure, okay, and that's that we can't. And I had to do this for my book with Oxford because I was writing about UFOs, but I was writing about it in a specific way that I hadn't done before. And the editor, Cynthia, wonderful person, but she pushed back a lot, and she said, "You can't do this. You can't believe." And at that point, I actually didn't believe, but I was still trying to make some moves here, strategic moves to make this, to complicate that, the ways in which, the frameworks within which we study that constrain us and put us into a false dichotomy of this is historical, or we reduce this to, excuse me, social effects and those kinds of things. Well, why can't they be real in ways in which we don't understand? And those were the questions I was asking. But we get pushed to not do that, and especially pre-tenure, I still say to upcoming graduate students, don't do it yet. Wait till you get tenure. And I certainly had tenure and was chair of my department before I wrote my book about UFOs, and then I didn't really care. But I must say that during my tenure, this was 10 years ago that I did actually get tenure, and I over-prepared. Because you do, right? And I knew I would get it, but one of the senior professors asked me what my future research would be, and I said, I'm really interested in this scholar named Jeffrey Kripal at Rice University and the work that he's doing, and they knew who he was. And they said, we're in a public university. Those kinds of things you can't do here, or what makes you think you can do those things here? Or those things are not important. The kinds of things that he's doing, speculative, theoretical, and it should be done at like Rice University. It shouldn't be done at this public university. And so they asked me, or at least this one man did, what makes you think you can do that? And I thought about it, and I said, tenure. So that's my. So I'd like to start off by asking the panelists about the frameworks that they're using to, to enter into these topics of the impossible. And I'd like, actually, you're here, Jeff. Is it okay if we start with you and just go down the line?
Sure.
Okay.
So I thought what I'd do is sort of talk a bit about my training. This is a panel about the academy, and I really want us to talk about the politics of the academy and why we do what we do and how we do it and what kind of resistances we meet, which you've just spoken to. So I was trained in the 1980s and the early 90s at the University of Chicago, and in a field called history of religions. And my intellectual heroes were people like Gananath Obiasegra, who's a Sinhalese Buddhist anthropologist that Wendy has published, and Sudhir Kakar, a South Asian Hindu psychoanalyst, and Wendy Doniger, an American Jewish comparativist. And I was also trained by a man named Bernie McGinn, who really is, I think, the world's greatest authority on Christian mysticism. And I was really interested in thinking about ecstatic religious experience in comparative ways that were sensitive to the kinds of gender and sexual orientation questions that were so evident in the 80s and 90s, but were edgy, frankly. And you paid a price for asking these questions then in a way that I'm not sure you pay a price today, but you definitely paid a price in the 80s and 90s. But so I studied comparative mystical literature for decades, and we never once talked about a miracle. We never once talked about a floating saint. It wasn't as if we were told we shouldn't. It was that we just didn't. It was just kind of we just ignored it. And I remember we were all reading William James, Varieties of Religious Experience, but nobody ever told us that James spent most of his adult life sitting with mediums and seances and studying psychical phenomena. I didn't even know that in graduate school. That just wasn't talked about. So there are just things that weren't said or weren't talked about. And I think the assumption, certainly I held the assumption, was that all these miracle stories and all these floating saints and all this mind reading and all this stuff, it was, these were legends, these were exaggerations, and they were, to use the Foucauldian terms, these were discourses that were used to accrue power and authority. These were things that didn't happen, that people were claiming that happened to, establish sanctity or establish the authority of the church or the tradition or whatever it might be. And that was really, I think, that was the working assumption. And I think it's still the working assumption, by the way, in the academy. What happened is, I won't tell you the whole story, but I ended up in California, of all places, studying the counterculture and talking to people who were really active in the 60s and 70s. And they were telling me the darndest stories. And they were telling me things that I knew couldn't possibly happen, but that I knew happened. And I was just so puzzled by that, because I knew that my mentors, whom I deeply admire, didn't prepare me for that. Nothing in my training prepared me to hear out-of-body experiences or near-death experiences or encounters with balls of light in Big Sur or whatever it was. There was nothing. I had nothing. And I knew I had nothing. And so I just got really interested in that disjunction. And I spent about 5 years essentially working on an intellectual history of what most people would think of as the paranormal. This is the authors of the Impossible book. And the conclusion I reached at the end of that book was, all of these categories were coined by scientists and academics. These were not words of the tabloids. These were words of the academy. And these are academic terms that intellectuals formed and worked very hard on in the late 19th and early 20th century. And they were very sophisticated, including the word paranormal, by the way. Very, very sophisticated. And then over the course of the 20th century, they enter pop culture, and behaviorism rises in psychology, and the computer modeling of the mind, and this kind of flatland physicalism sets in, and people start to roll their eyes at this kind of stuff. But that wasn't the case 100 years ago at all, or 120, 130 years ago. During that time, I was chairing the department here, which consists of 13 faculty members, most of whom have tenure. I was exposed to a broad range of approaches, and now I work in the dean's office. And I say that because it's really informed how I think about this. I think about scholarship in the broader sense of the humanities or the social sciences or even the sciences. I think about the university, and I think about how we police one another, and we discipline ourselves, and we assume our own ideologies, frankly. And academics are doing this just like everybody else. We have ideologies. We have assumptions we make. I think they're false assumptions, but I think they do good work. Or they're not false. They're half right, as I say. They're not false, but they're just inadequate. I have talked about. I've never stopped talking about this stuff, by the way, to anyone who will listen. But I didn't wait for tenure, Diana. I mean, Colley's Child was written before tenure, and it got me kicked out of an entire country. So I wasn't very smart. And I think when I found these paranormal phenomena, they felt a lot to me like gender and sexuality did in the 80s and 90s. And I was like, oh, let's do this. Let's cause trouble here now. And so that's why I got interested in it. And I've spoken out loud to literally hundreds of audiences, both in Europe and the US. And I say that not to brag, but to answer a question I get all the time. And that question is, how do you deal with the pushback? And my answer is always, what pushback? intellectuals and scientists do not generally deny these phenomena. They are in the closet. They will not talk about them, but they won't talk about them because they're afraid to sound like the tabloids. And so what I do is I just walk into a university or walk into a lecture hall and I start talking about them with Foucault and Derrida and Gunnenut or Ed May or whoever I'm talking about, and they're like, oh, that's how you do it. You can actually be you can be an intellectual and still talk about these things, and it's okay. And so that's kind of been the basic method I've used. I'm also have been really informed by teaching undergraduates here. Rice is a very small, very elite research university, and most of our students are STEM. Science, technology, engineering, or mathematics. And the overwhelming reception I get when I walk into a classroom is one of total and complete apathy. And it's so palpable that some students will even comment on it. And they're like, how do you deal with that? How do you survive emotionally? And, you know, I just teach the kids who will listen, and I kind of try to ignore the kids who don't really care. But the reason that's significant is when I first got here 20 years ago, I was teaching religious studies with, you know, classic religious texts. You know, I was having them read Teresa of Avila and little Shankara or whoever it was, and of course they would just dismiss them. Oh, these are just pre-modern religious people who don't know better. They don't know their science. If they knew their science, they wouldn't say these ridiculous things. That was essentially the attitude. So I was like, okay, I'll use scientists. I'll talk about the out-of-body experiences of engineers and medical professionals and scientists. I'll give them their own people. And so I started to work on essentially the spiritual lives of scientists, and I found that has really helped, actually, because it challenges these young people kind of at the core. And it shows that, you know, scientists are people too. And I often joke that the sciences are just a subdivision of the humanities. And then, you know, so have you ever met a scientist who wasn't a human being? I actually haven't. So, I mean, I really think that's true, though. I really think there's something deeply human about the sciences and about scientists, and I've really tried to push that. The last thing I'll say, and then I'll hand it over to Joe, is this is where I get a little crabby, particularly with academics. I'll often tell my graduate students, they've all heard this, so you can close your eyes or go to your cell phone or whatever. You can't really become a comparativist until you've lost at least 2 worldviews. And this is what I mean by that. If you assume the worldview you were born into, and I don't care what that worldview was, I don't care what the culture was, I don't care if it's an indigenous culture. If you haven't lost that culture, you assume that that culture is adequate to the human condition. Once you lose that worldview, the chances are very high that you will just jump into another worldview. You will convert to something else, and you'll think that has the answers you're looking for. But once that worldview fails you, you're going to hesitate to jump into another worldview. You're going to be like, well, wait a minute. Maybe this third worldview is just like the first one I was born into and the second one I converted to. And it's at that point, I think you become a real comparativist. And you essentially refuse to land. You know, to use Hussein's language, you drop your gear and you run. You know, you run from the fire. And I don't think most people can do that, frankly. And so that's kind of the hard message to my academic colleagues is I don't think we're doing that. I think we're assuming a whole set of assumptions, and I think we have to drop them. And the reason I love this stuff is because it just doesn't fit in. It just messes everything up, including our assumptions about everything, really. And I think that's what we should be about. I think we should be about messing things up, not assuming something. So I'll stop there.
Thanks. I've been thinking about the path that sort of led to me being in this room, and I think it began in Atlanta in about 2007 when I started studying a group called the Atlanta Vampire Alliance, and these are self-declared, quote unquote, real vampires. Some of them actually consume human blood, but most of them were psychic vampires, and they said to sustain our health, we have to feed on the psychic energy of others, and we try to find ethical ways to do that. And this became my first kind of serious research project, my first serious ethnographic project. I was really excited to bracket. I was like, I'm going to bracket, right? And I learned really quickly that the weaknesses of that approach. And I didn't know that twilight was on the way. So then I became this big vampire person for 15 minutes. And this was a group that was pathologized. So one of the main things I wanted to do was sort of get past this narrative of either this is profound mental illness, or this is some sort of anti-Christian sort of cult that's out to murder us. There was a lot of the rhetoric of the satanic panic coloring this community. And I published that in the article Novo Religio, which I'm now a co-editor of. And one of the pieces of feedback that I got was it's really important that you were clear that these people are not really vampires and that psychic energy isn't real. And I just thought that's kind of a double standard, right? If I wrote about Methodists, I wouldn't have to say, now these Methodists believe they have an immortal soul. And there's this place called heaven. Of course, none of this is true. But anyways, here's what I think about Methodists. And so we're trying to present what we're doing as being rational and sort of, if not scientific, kind of having a sound methodology to it. So why are we treating one set of data this way and the other set of data the other way? And Leonard Premiano talked a lot about this. He was a religious studies scholar, and he called this the two-tier model of religion, right? So the world religions go over here, and the vampires, if they're a religion at all, as opposed to just madness, right, they go over here, right? And so I was very interested in this, and then I went on to get my PhD at Boston University, and my advisor, Steve Prothero, whose own dissertation had been on theosophy, said, you should do your dissertation on Jonathan Edwards, not the psychic, the hellfire preacher, right, from the First Great Awakening. And I said, what am I going to say that's new about Jonathan Edwards, right? And he said, well, that's the point. You want a really boring dissertation that's not interesting to anyone because that's the only way you'll ever get a job, right? And so I was interested in these topics, and yet all the advice was don't do those topics. And I settled on Veronica Lukin, partly because not much had been done on that, but also I kind of wanted to say, I dare you to say the Catholic Church goes in that second tier group, right? And actually, lots of people were totally fine doing that, right? Saying what you're doing is not appropriate religious studies. It's not real Catholicism. It's a no good Scotsman argument. It's not proper Catholicism. And so when I went onto the job market, I kind of noticed there was on the one hand this desire for respectability. We only want to hire people who kind of fit neatly in the so-called world religions paradigm, even as though at the same time the whole field is sort of bemoaning the world religions paradigm, even as we are continuing to build it up, right, bigger and bigger. And yet there was an idea that there is kind of a place for this material because it attracts undergraduates, right? And so I was actually able to get a job at Texas State because they were creating a new religious studies major, and they just asked the students, what kinds of courses would you like? And I think they thought the students were going to say something like, well, I'm interested in global business, and so I think that knowledge of Islam would prepare me to compete in the global marketplace. I think that's what they thought they were going to say. And of course, the students said UFOs and, Jonestown and, all the stuff they had seen on the History Channel. And fortunately, they actually trusted what the students said, and I got the job, right? And I've been thinking about this almost as a kind of Madonna whore complex, right, that I'm encountering, and that's kind of an impolite way of putting it, but there is sort of, on the one hand, we want you to kind of put on the paranormal lingerie when no one's looking to bring in the undergraduates, right, to get new majors. And then when the donors or the Texas legislature comes, right, be a lady, right, and look proper. And I've sort of thought a lot about how kind of demented this is, right? And so we've talked a lot about new realities, and I think this is kind of the reality that I'd like to push back against. And Dr. Kripal framed this as a Foucauldian discourse, which is a much better way of how I thought about it, but it's invisible. And, you know, in our last panel, we talked about Richard Dawkins said, I don't think this is how we should do science, but he at least had arguments, and you could argue back. This is invisible, right? You never get told you can't do this. It's more like a group of mean middle schoolers rolling their eyes at you, right? You said Foucauldian discourse of power, which is a better way of putting it, but that's what it feels like. And so what I am most excited about with the work going on here is smashing through that invisible two-tier model of religion. Thanks.
Awesome.
Well, I don't really know how I'm supposed to follow that. You know, I don't have any kind of paranormal lingerie on. But since we're talking about ourselves and how we got into this interests and into these positions, I went to college, and the kind of narrative I told myself was that I was going to become a neuroscientist. That was what my mother told me I should be. And so pretty quickly, I realized that I was not cut out for that. And I became very, very interested in religious studies. And I was raised Catholic. I still am Catholic, and I was thinking about all the ways that these certain kinds of stories were informing these religious traditions. And so somewhere along the way, I started doing this research into stories, into narratives, and in that I discovered the Gesar epic, which is a Tibetan epic in kind of, some people call it Buddhicized, and I'll talk a little bit why I think that's a big problem. And I fell in love with this particular story and how this story really informs Tibetans' worldviews, and that no one was looking at this particular story because, as Joe brought up, this two-tier model of religion in so many ways says, well, Buddhism is sutras and meditation, and Buddhism is, maybe we can say it's an autobiography, but it's not a crazy warrior king who slays demons and goes to hell and has a talking horse and a talking sword. That's not Buddhism, even though every Tibetan I encountered was like, oh, he's a great Buddha and he's teaching us great Buddhist truths. So I continued this research. I did my undergraduate at William & Mary, and then I went on to University of Chicago, where I studied with Wendy and I studied with Bruce Lincoln. And that was where I started to encounter scholars that were saying, maybe that these assumptions that we carry into us in the academy aren't useful. Particularly, I remember reading Chakrabarty and learning about the theories of the subaltern, and that was this moment. He talks about how Western historians come in and say, well, Shiva obviously didn't do this. That's a misunderstanding. And he said, well, why? What kinds of colonial ideas are we bringing into another country, into another culture, when we say, well, those brown people are wrong? Us white people understand what's actually happening. And that just revolutionized the way I thought about this, and just kind of blew apart the way I was actually approaching the Gesar epic. I went on to do my PhD at University of Virginia, which has a very long history of Tibetan studies. And I wanted originally to do my research on the Gesar epic and spirit possession, because the bards that tell the story actually undergo a form of possession where the narrative itself possesses them. And as they tell the story, they are actually living the epic in this sort of visionary experience. And I wanted to look at that as a Buddhist practice. And I was told by my advisor, very similarly to Joe, that you can't do that. No one will invite you to the Buddhist studies parties. You need to do something Buddhism related. And so it became this kind of weird negotiation of going back and forth of being like, what can I do? How would I do when this epic hero goes to hell and I do Buddhist hell journeys? And that was considered finally Buddhist enough that I could join all the Buddhism parties. Since graduating, though, I've been interested more in these stories and how stories shape reality in so many ways. So I'm interested in the impossible, especially for how, when we take seriously these extraordinary experiences people have happened to them, how we can understand and kind of actually get closer to this thing that we're calling the truth. Everyone so far has brought up this idea of bracketing, so I don't need to re-explain that, but I do think that bracketing disenfranchises the person having the experience. And often these people having the experiences are indigenous, impoverished, uneducated, or quite frankly, not white and male. So this is what they were talking about in the last panel, the kind of threatening forms of agency. And I thought Sam yesterday in the paracologies panel noted that the possible is political. And I think that's such a powerful phrase in the way that we approach our scholarship and the way we think about that. Because my own work, quite frankly, shows that stories have this kind of incredible power, and things like the Geisar epic aren't just entertainment, but they actually do produce and shape reality itself. They shape the person, they shape the entire way that Tibetans think about and experience their own realities. And so I actually really like that Jeff discussed waking up inside a story. I also think there's value, though, in laying and sleeping in a story and kind of wrapping that story around you like a blanket and just sort of living in that story, letting that story actually affect you. Because for my research and informants, the people I work with so closely, Geisar, but also the Buddha, Dakinis, all these kind of figures in the Buddhist sphere aren't just stories. They are active participants that are shaping their reality and shaping their own lives. If I don't really investigate that, I've made this terrible, grave error. As we were kind of talking about, I wrote down my notes because, like Whitley, if I don't write it down, I'm just going to wander off and start talking about something that doesn't make any sense. But I do think that part of wrapping ourselves in the stories is also acknowledging the limits of our own subjectivities. One of the kind of research interests that I have recently gotten into is monster theory and the way that we think about these sorts of challenging and otherworldly figures. And of course, as I'm sure everyone in this room understands, monsters tell us as much about the person making the declaration that that is a monster as it does about the monster itself, because what is one person's monster is another person's god. And I think that as, you know, in so many ways, we acknowledge that with monsters, everyone will say that, here's why you shouldn't use monster in this context, and you should in that context. But all of the words we use, I think, have that effect. When we talk about reality, we talk about religion, about culture, even about what the self is. By just using those words, they're telling people as much about ourselves using that kind of idea, and that we need to be very honest and open about our own subjectivities. So, and the final thing I did want to kind of think about that I think has been a theme so far throughout the panel is this idea about the balance of how we push back against these boundaries of academia. As we, you know, in Texas State University, we have a very new religious studies major. We're starting to get our first students that are going on to graduate work in religion. And there's this anxiety of advising them, of helping them try to figure out how you do the type of research that they want to do, but also make sure that they have the best chance and opportunity of gaining a job at the end of that. I think the university claims that it values interdisciplinary work, and it really does not. And I think what has really become out for this conference, at least for me, is that to study these types of events, we need to be interdisciplinary. Looking at just from the perspective of a scholar of religion does not help. We also need scientists, we need, you know, kind of engineers, we need people, just all sorts of diverse forms of knowledge, and yet the way that the university functions is that it kind of pushes us back into these categories again. And I think that there's a real problem there, and I'm not quite sure how to solve it, but I hope that we can at least start some questions.
Well, thank you. A lot of what all of you have said is really resonating with me. I'll tell a story about my first challenge with publishing at Columbia was I wanted to start an animal studies list, and at that time the press wasn't a department of the university. So in addition to the constant financial concerns, there was also how did we rank? You know, would the managers see that we were doing something valuable? And people at the press said, "No, this is really soft. This is anthropomorphic. There's nothing here, you can't do it." And so I spent a few months doing a lot of research. I compiled 100 pages of where this was taught and what departments, who had published what, and it was very impressive. And so finally they said, okay, And as I got involved in it further, I realized that, it really did interconnect with just about every field, not only in the humanities. I mean, in religion, you find all of the wizards and things that are associated with animals in say, South Asian religions. It resonated with, in American religion, the kind of, how dogs, for example, were stand-ins for Black Americans in certain kinds of, racist contexts. It really touched on just about all kinds of categories that were of interest in the humanities. So this ended up becoming like a really vibrant part of our list, and most especially a very political, part of our list, because I see, there's nothing that really isn't political. I mean, it always is. How are women treated in this context? How are, other, class, all of these things come up. It's almost impossible to avoid them, and we shouldn't avoid them. And even though people may try to tell you to avoid them, you just can't avoid them. And the other thing too that I think, was it you who mentioned about putting yourself into the book? Yeah, I mean, I what I love, what I think the future of academic writing is something that you have a case, you have a story, you have an ethnography, you have a theory, and you put your standpoint right there. I mean, you cannot really take yourself out of that story. Why you are interested is very much part of why other people will be interested. You are really setting a stage, I think, and I find that really useful. And you mentioned Steve Prothero, and he recommended a wonderful author to me, Onahe Woodbine, who writes about, his first book was about playing street basketball in Boston, but then his second book is like way out there. It's about this woman, seer, prophetess, who was kind of almost a street person, had been gone through all kinds of struggles with being raped, but she spoke to the spirits of dead people, and this was kind of what she did, and then she gave advice to people who asked her what the spirits had told her to tell them about the problems that they were facing. And he's trained as a Yoruba shaman in addition to his degree in religious studies, and really came to interact with her. I mean, he's very much a part of the story. He's kind of like, if not, he's not the main character, but he's the second most important, and really participating in this in his own way, and I found it like astounding to read. I mean, he's a very good writer, which doesn't hurt, but it's now he's like transitioning his first book into a graphic novel. He wrote a play based on it that was performed, in a theater that sponsored by Oprah Winfrey in South Africa. And he's just, the model of someone who has been able to make something different out of his academic world while still, having a position. He just got promoted. He's at American University. He just got promoted to associate professor. But it's, to me, like, discovering these kinds of exciting new ways to kind of like push back against academia and the things that people are telling young scholars what to do. I mean, I hear this on panels on publishing that I give all the time, and that students are saying that their teachers are telling them, publish on something very boring, and just, why? You're starting your life here. This is your life's work, It's so, yeah, the best teachers don't do that, but I mean, you hear a lot of that. Even at Yale, at Harvard, even all over, so.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so that brings me to a question for the panelists. I think that we are our colleagues' worst nightmare, because we become the public, our books are, as you put it, they have some pretty cool lingerie associated with them. And so they're very popular. And so when a person picks up, let's use Brent Landau's book, Revelation of the Magi, as a good example, because is Jacques here? Hi, Jacques. And Jacques referenced that in his talk. And so Brent is this unassuming graduate student, I believe at Harvard, right?
Well, he's at UT now. Also.
Oh, that's right. Yeah, he should be here. So he translates this book, which is, I think it's in Syriac. It's a really old book. It's the Revelation of the Magi. Nobody's translated it. He doesn't know what it's about, really. And it turns out to be about the nativity and what Jacques showed us, the picture, this small being in something that looks like an orb, okay? And so he translates it, he publishes it with Oxford, I think with Cynthia, and it just takes off. And it takes off because it appeals to people who've had this experience. And they're taking it, now Brent, of course, has gone through what we've gone through, so he's being very careful just to do the translation and saying, this is what they thought, this is, I'm just translating this, I'm bracketing my belief. But the people who are receiving it are interpreting it as, factual UFO, literal, for back in the day. So they reinterpret their own tradition of Christianity as, hey, this was like Jesus came down in an orb in a UFO before he was actually born, and that type of thing. And that took off. And he had, I'm sure it wasn't as many letters as Whitley, but it was a lot. And he read some of the letters in one of our conferences, and they were touching. So, like I said, I think that we are the public-facing, the ones who do the weird stuff. We're the ones whose books are selling, and people are then associating us with our field, which is religious studies. So we're put in this position. And so I just wanted to ask you what how you feel about that. That's happened to you as well. And most likely it's happened to you both as well. And I'm sure you deal with it with your authors. So I guess what are the consequences of something like that? Do you get pushback from your colleagues about, do you really have to do this? Like this, I'm not associated in any way with that. You're making my field look bad or something like that.
A lot of envy, I would say, an awful lot of envy. And I think that the envy is and the fear of being overshadowed by someone else who might be younger than you in a lower position than you. I think that's really funneling almost all of it.
I think, well, first of all, I can't get the image of Joe in lingerie out of my head. That's my first problem. Again, I don't feel pushback, Diana. I mean, it's a dangerous word, but I actually love intellectuals, and I love what they do. And I think when colleagues really understand what we do, they're like, oh, okay, that's part of what we do as well. There's a community there. Now, where it's tough is with our graduate students and our younger intellectuals trying to get a job. I mean, that's where it's tough. Because people come to me, young people come to me every year basically wanting to be a professor of the paranormal. And I say, no. I say, I'm Stephen, probably. I'm like, no, you can't do that. And the parable I use is actually, from my childhood. It's Superman. I'm like, look, I know you're Superman, but I'm going to teach you how to be Clark Kent. And you're going to have to go to the Daily Planet every day. You're going to have to put a pair of glasses on, and you're going to have to write boring shit. But you can go into the phone booth anytime you want, and you're Superman. I get it. I really, and I look for those students. I look for what I call the X factor. I really want Superman or Superwoman. But it's a challenge. I don't think it's a challenge for us. I think it's a challenge for people trying to get a job. That would be my response.
I err on being conservative in my suggestions to them. I say wait for tenure before you do it.
Yeah. Well, no,
maybe I'm wrong, though.
I do too. Well,
Maybe
Tim
I'm
can
wrong.
tell you, I do too. I'm like, wrap it in what you're doing. Like, I wouldn't tell you to do a dissertation on Jonathan Edwards. But I would say, whatever you're interested in, if you're interested in vampires, wrap it into a Jonathan Edwards dissertation.
And I do think what I thought was really interesting with the example of Brent Landau is that, as you said, The Revelation of the Magi is a very scholarly academic book, but he's bracketed, but he doesn't get to control the readers and how they bracket. And I think this sort of reveals the lie of bracketing, that we just assume, like, if we bracket, our readers will bracket and they will be interested in it. And like that's not what people do, because bracketing is so unnatural. It's so unhuman in so many ways. Because I think humans just want to be understood with each other, and they want to tell each other things.
So we're in an interesting position because we're a religious studies major, but we're housed in a department of philosophy. Yeah. And some days I find the philosophers super annoying because they tend to think of everything in intellectual propositions that are either true or false. And one of them literally asked me, so which religion is true? Like, you've been doing this for a while. Have you figured this out? Yeah, which one's true? But on the other hand, they don't have the mean sort of invisible rules to the same extent about what's okay to study and what isn't. The philosophers have never told me that the things I study are weird or shouldn't be studied. So that's kind of interesting and encouraging. I think the biggest thing driving all of this is that sort of the humanities especially is in peril, all right? That states don't want to fund it. Bashing intellectuals and bashing the academy has become kind of red meat in certain political discourses. I mean, right now we're talking about critical race theory and banning books and all of this. And I think for some people, and I think this goes back decades, the response has been, well, we just have to be really respectable. Right? If we're respectable enough, then our institutions will be secure, and this will end. And I think it's kind of like drinking salt water, right? The more we try to be respectable, the more we actually lose the argument that we're providing something, right? That we're contributing something. So I think people who will trade interesting research topics for respectability will ultimately end up with neither, right? And the last thing I'll say is this cuts to a debate about what the purpose of higher education is. And I think certainly at Texas State, the assumption is it's about creating a job base for the state of Texas, right? Creating a workforce. When we created a new religious studies major, this is true, we were asked to go to monster.com and find jobs in Texas that said you must have a religious studies major to get this job. That was required. And so we kind of said, all right, you want to play this game? We can play this game. Guess where the highest paid preachers in America all live? In Texas, right? And we're going to average those out, and we're going to say that our graduates, we anticipate they're going to make all of this money. So we won, we got the major, but in this very stupid, dishonest way, right? That was based on this assumption, which I don't agree with. And I think that going back to C. Prothero again, his philosophy was there's several points to college. One is to get a good job, but another one is to ask big questions. Because a lot of people, this is the only time in their life when they get to ask big questions. Because once they're out of college, they've got a family and a mortgage and this kind of stuff, and they don't get to sit around talking about these things anymore. And I think that is an area where the work being done at this conference is super important, right? Depending on what your philosophy of education is.
Wendy, did you have anything to say about?
Well, to add, it's funny. Philosophy has been proven to be the one undergraduate major that has the most success,
yes.
even outside, even including the STEM professions. I mean, it's just more kind of big shot people like Carl Icahn have been philosophy majors than anything else. But that's just neither here nor there. But I agree, and I think that the humanities question isn't going to go away. I think that the best way to kind of demonstrate it, like you say, is to prove that you're offering something that students want, because that's going to always talk to the university administrations. I mean, if they see that they can bring bodies in because you're doing something controversial or exciting or a new way of looking at religion or philosophy, or emphasizing gender and other kinds of critical theories, when you're not supposed to be studying them. I mean, to me, I think as individuals, fighting back against the people who are fighting us is like one of the most important things that we could be doing in our lives. I mean, it's just like insane to me that kids are being brought up now that don't even know that the context of American history, we abused other populations, So, I think it's really important to offer that. And I think that maybe, in time that will become more of a prevailing view than it is right now. I mean, right now we're just in a really dark age, and
I think, too, if I can pop in, Wendy, your comments reminded me of something I tried to say in my opening remarks. I think the academy today lives under the sign of the negative, to use Jason's phrase, which I think is spot on. Humanists in particular have a very difficult time of saying anything positive. There's a lot to critique. There's a lot to say no to. There's a lot of injustice and suffering in the world. And so we've honed these methods to deconstruct those devastatingly racist and gendered and unjust social systems. But people also want to hear something positive. This has come up in the conference. Nia, I don't know if Nia's here this morning, but she really wanted to know, well, what do we say? What do we do? And academics are really bad at that. We were trained not to offer anything positive. And I think we have to get out of that. I think we have to learn what the academy under the sign of the positive looks like. And we're just not there yet. We're just not there.
Because I think deconstruction is fun for a lot of people. It's kind of like you can be like a gotcha kind of moment, but it doesn't lead to anything, and it's really easy to do. Is we can all poke holes in each other's arguments, from here to next Tuesday, but it's harder to say something.
I taught for 9 years at this small liberal arts college in Western Pennsylvania, and it was mostly Catholic kids, actually, Catholics and Presbyterians. And I would spend all fall deconstructing all of their worldviews, and then I would send them home for Christmas. And I was like, wow, there is something wrong about that. And so I realized we needed a way to kind of tie a bow around the deconstruction and then move on.
Yeah.
Okay, how do you put the pieces back together now? And again, we don't do that. But I think we have to learn to do that.
We
I
just
do that.
published this fun book called The Great Minds Don't Think Alike, and it's a series of debates between scientists and people who are mostly from religion, but also other kinds of humanities scholars. And they really talk frankly and honestly about their disagreements. They end up convincing each other of certain kinds of points, but it's a really productive, I mean, it's for the general public, it's very successful, but I mean, I think it points to a way, that these disciplines could engage each other in the academy, maybe co-teach or, really bring together, science and the humanities much more directly.
One text I've been thinking a lot about at this conference is an essay by Robert Orsi on Rudolf Otto. And Orsi was a big influence on how I do my work as an Americanist, and also actually how I approached vampires, because with some of the issues that he raises. And, he emphasizes we should be sort of deconstructing religions as discourses in power, and we should be doing all of this. But we have to remember that's not all there is, right? There's a remainder once you've gotten through all of that. And he calls this in that essay the tradition of the more, right? So, okay, so you've identified this, but there's something left. And that something is actually rather mysterious. And going back to the fourth garment of AOTI, mathematics, he uses this idea of 2 + 2 = 5. To think about that. And it's maybe a spark of a direction that gets us past the sign of the negative.
Orsi's work is so rich, I think that really, he appeals to a lot of students, they really get into religion from him. Yeah, I'm fortunate to be working with him on his new book. I think it's one of a very exciting experience.
He's also influenced me a lot. Okay. Bob Orsi, Robert Orsi. I think he's at Northwestern.
Yes, that's
Yeah, okay. I have another question here, and perhaps this has to do with hope. So let's talk about the current context of research. We can't ignore that just recently the government released a report about UFOs where, again, they admitted that there are these things that they basically said there were these things that are impossible. All right. They didn't say what they were, but other people did in the media. I'll talk about that tonight. But, what that did, a lot of what we do is we review manuscripts for presses. And what happened after or just before and after that report came out was I was flooded with basically I had to do reviews of this new scholarship. So I can guarantee you that in the next year or the next 2 years, there will be a tsunami of new research by academics in all fields that are dealing with the idea of UFOs and UAPs. And I think that this is interesting because this didn't happen before, and this has only just happened. So have you experienced that? Are you getting asked by presses to do? I of course, wrote a book that has the UFO in the title, so that's why I'm identified. But there's something has changed, something has shifted, and I'm wondering what you have to say about that shift.
I haven't gotten, a ton. I probably get 200 proposals every week. It's impossible to even keep up with it all. But what I have not received is 200 proposals on, religious interpretations of UFOs.
And, I situate myself in Buddhist studies, and I think Buddhist studies is working very, very hard to ignore all this, and is working very, very hard to not think about these issues. And I think this speaks a lot to the interdisciplinarity that is needed. When I did leave my graduate program, I found that my best conversation partners oftentimes were not in Buddhist studies, and that were outside of Buddhist studies. And I was trying to kind of carry them back in and show them to my colleagues, like a raccoon bringing little gifts to people. It's worked about 50% of the time.
Yeah, I'm rarely approached by the media about paranormal topics, although I get asked about things like QAnon, or I was recently asked, is Bitcoin a religion? Answer this question, right? But one thing that this makes me think of, so in my field of new religious movements, I think the biggest argument for new religious movements is that when people are really scared of an odd religious group, this is how we get things like Waco. Right? I believe Waco was completely preventable if they had kind of listened to the right people. So after Waco, the FBI began working with the American Academy of Religion, and they would even send agents to watch panels by the New Religious Movements unit. And anecdotally, they said, well, there was no actionable intelligence. It was just this boring 90-minute discussion about this weird stuff, right? This didn't help us. And there is an anecdote that they actually invited someone to help them with the simulation. And they said, okay, well, you guys know more about this stuff than we do, so Agent Bob over here is going to be a crazed cult leader, and you tell us whether or not to tear gas him and when. And they kind of just say, that's not what we do, right? I let you all make tough decisions, and then I write books about why you made the wrong decision. So I guess what I'm kind of getting at here is the pacing between the kind of news cycle, or even when governments want our advice, which is very rare, and then the pace at which we actually produce knowledge and produce kind of smart ways of thinking about things are so out of sync. Right, that I think this is a tremendous obstacle for being relevant.
I believe I tell my students that academics are useless jellyfish that just kind of float around and don't say anything. So we don't say you should do something, we'll just tell you why what you're doing is wrong.
But I think the jellyfish are doing something, but it's so imperceptible. It's a sort of ecological important structure, but you can't observe it.
We're worse than jellyfish.
Yeah, they can't. There you go. Yeah. But they can't pull you to shore if you're drowning or something. You need a dolphin or something to do that. Yeah.
I think it's a time to open it up to questions from the audience. Okay. How about this gentleman over here?
Hi, thank you all so much for this really cool and interesting and important panel. I wonder if, rather than moving on from deconstruction, we could move on with deconstruction. Derrida, considered the sort of arch practitioner of deconstruction, even he did have some positive and affirmative things to say, although they tended to be very cryptic. But my question, thank you, Natasha, for your really great points that you made. And I'm thinking about the academy as a sort of a culturally and historically specific institution or set of institutions. Foucault came up in this panel multiple times. Foucault, develops this idea of subjugated knowledge, and meaning to refer to kinds of knowledge that are confined in the institution of the asylum. And then Gayatri Spivak picks that up and sort of geopoliticizes it and thinks about subjugated knowledge as an effect, subjugating different knowledges as an effect of colonialism, colonization. And so the reason I sort of narrate this is just to continue to make explicit the extent to which the kind of exclusions and abjections that we've been talking about in this conference have investments in things like white supremacy. And so I guess the short version of my question is, what did y'all think of what Natasha said?
I mean, yes. I think that when we look at the history of our field, it's fully racist and sexist and colonialist, absolutely. If we don't integrate that knowledge into how we teach our undergrads and graduate students, we're not doing this right. So absolutely. I think, though, that we have a fluid field, it changes, and that, we have people like Natasha now acknowledging that. So I guess that would be my answer, that we've hopefully changed. But yeah, those are our roots. There's no doubt about it.
I mean, I think another big piece of this is, who are we deconstructing, right? We historically, we have deconstructed the cultures that we're studying, but we don't like to deconstruct ourselves, right? We hate to be studied ourselves. And bracketing, which I still find useful, is by design a kind of shield, right? Because I'd say, well, tell me about being a psychic vampire. What's that like, right? And they'd say, well, what do you believe? I said, oh, I don't have beliefs. I'm bracketed. Yeah. Right? I get to deconstruct you. You don't get to deconstruct me. And I think you're right. It's very, very important that does get turned around on us, right? And I think we're going to learn a lot the more that we do that.
And I think it's a lie that somehow makes us better scholars. In my own fieldwork in Tibet, the times it was most productive is when I wasn't a researcher and I was just like, I love the Gesar epic, tell me a story. And then they told me a story, then I told them a story, and then we just kind of start building and jiving with each other, and that was much more productive field work than going in and putting my little glasses on and trying to say.
And we're seeing lots more of that kind of field work
Yes.
now. I mean, the field really is changing in that respect.
Good question. Oh, let's see. How about this gentleman over here?
I'm sure I'll get a different answer with this panel than the previous, but I wanted to know if you think we need to move away from empiricism and sort of reductionist materialism to understand the impossible, and I see this sort of tug of war between the two. And for legitimacy in our modern world, we need empiricism, but it might not help us in understanding what's really going on, and sort of curious where you stand on that.
So I can speak to that?
Yeah, go for it.
Yeah, so it's Brad, it's a profound question. I'm with Eric and Mike on this, the earlier panel. I think science is really, really important. It's the number one influence on the religious imagination today, at least with the people I work with. And I think anything we do needs to engage empiricism and physicalism and the sciences in a really, really savvy and smart way. I think, though, that what makes this material so impossible is that it's not a set of objects, or not a set of objects in the way the scientists or the physicists want, but it's also not a set of subjects. It's neither subjective nor objective in a pure sense. Physical reality behaves in a dreamlike way. And so it has both subjective and objective qualities to it. And we just we don't know what to do with that. And so that's why it kind of falls in between, I think, our academic disciplines. But I also think that's why it's so important. So I'm not, Eric and I have this conversation a lot. Or Ed May. They think I'm against materialism, and I'm not. And they're very weird materialists, by the way. If everybody was a materialist like they are, I would embrace materialism, frankly. So I think it's just what kind of materialism we have, and what kind of physicalism, what kind of science we're doing. So that would be my answer to that.
I have I'll be talking about that actually in my talk later. How about over there, Whitley?
I am speaking to your brief comment, Diana, that there's a lot of work being done now in the academy around the whole UFO, UAP phenomenon. I've been aware of that too, but what I haven't been aware of is any approach to the experience or phenomenon. And the most basic questions, are they related? I don't think we know that. I don't think we know that because there's never been any direct relationship between the two that's empirically visible anyway. But nevertheless, the body of experience is there, and it is huge, and it is extensive. It is sort of the elephant in the room when it comes to both, well, first the academy, because I don't think science is going to be able to approach it to find ways in without first the academy beginning to define what it is contextually as part of the culture. And I think that's absolutely essential. And I'm curious if any of you have considered the idea of what tools you may use to approach this material. There's a huge, the letters that are here, for example, or the even more vast body of narrative experience that's available all over the place. How do you approach that? Because this is it's not outside of the context of mystical, religious, or numinous experience at all. It's very well within that, but it's considered an outlier, sort of an untouchable. Is there any chance that the Academy may begin to approach it as a touchable?
From my experience, I've had a lot of, like I said, manuscripts come in from Yale, Oxford, Rutledge, and it's interdisciplinary. Some of it is social scientific research about these questions that you're suggesting we ask. So it looks like that kind of research is being done, and I think that it needed just to have that legitimacy given by the government so that these people now can feel free to do this. So that's my opinion. And actually, that's what
I
I've seen.
agree. I think that a lot of it is social scientific research, and that's why my colleague, who's a sociologist, would be getting these proposals and not me. But yeah, because that's where you start. You can interview people. You can do. You can use DH kind of techniques to go through the language of these reports. There's work that could easily be done, whereas the meaning-making side of things is a little bit more difficult.
Yeah, up in the. Oh, I'm sorry. Okay.
Is this on? Yeah. Hi, thank you so much for the panel, and it's really thought-provoking, and I kind of just wanted to bounce off of the question that Whitley just asked, which came up several more times. It was talked about how we might be able to start thinking about and moving past talking about like deconstruction and what's impossible, and maybe start building something new to talk about these things as they are possible. And I was just wondering if maybe anyone might have thoughts about like actual steps that scholarship could begin to take to bolster this field and really build up how to talk about these things as not being impossible, but actually occurring, and talking about them as though they are possible and real.
Sam referenced Derrida, whose one of his last essays was called Telepathy. But I can't get Derridians to read it, other than Nicholas Royal and Tim Morton and Sam, right? So he basically just says telepathy is real, it happens, and he tells his own experiences of telepathy, and I think that's kind of removing the brackets. I think that's what we have to do. I think we have to remove the brackets. We have to say that people have precognitive dreams, people have telepathic experiences, people see and encounter UFOs. We don't know what that means or what that is, but we know it happens. That's sort of my base definition. It happens, and then we kind of work from there. That would be my answer, Chris.
Let's go up to the top row.
It kind of sounds like, to me, the bracket is maybe between research and practice. And I just wonder what your relationship is to your art departments at your universities, and like what role you think art departments might play in this conversation. Because a lot of art students, but also like art faculty, are super receptive to the work of Jeff and Whitley Strieber and Diana at my institution. They're reading you as well. And you have faculty who are self-proclaimed shamans and mystics, and then students whose practice is creating ritual and research practices that are really tunneling into Annie Besant, or channeling, or whatever has caught their interest. And within an academic context, within their studios, they have the opportunity to really dig into this stuff and actively practice. So there's a suspension maybe of this bracket between practice and research. But then, I just curated a show on consciousness and talked to a science department that's studying anomalous cognition, and they're like, well, what does art have to do with science? Like, why is this a conversation we'd want to have? And it was like, even Jung, once he was able to transgress, into the spiritual, but then when one of his guides was like, oh, you're meant to be an artist, he's like, okay, no, I can't go there. That's a little bit too weird. So just wondering what your thoughts are on how the art department might weigh into this.
So I mentioned earlier how frustrated I get with the philosophers and their obsession with intellectual propositions, and I see art as a really important antidote or counterbalance to that, because art has this ability to communicate something without fully understanding it, right? There's an essay that I sign when I'm trying to get my students to think about the book of Genesis, and they quote this famous ballerina, and they said, what does your dance mean? And said, well, if I could just tell you what it meant, I would not have had to do the dance, right? And they're suggesting this is how we approach Genesis, not as a geology textbook, but as something with kind of this profound meaning that's not sort of easily articulated. I'll say one more thing, which is Susan Palmer, who's an NRM scholar, has said, I think of these new religious movements, these very strange little groups, as art forms, right? It's not so much that, well, they're really talking to UFOs or they aren't, and that's the important question, but it's really sort of to understand them, we have to use the art as a beginning, as an entry point, right? To have some kind of analog for thinking about their worldview, and that is one way past the kind of the gap that always exists between scholars and the people that they study.
I'll just add, Petra, I think the real thing first of all, of course, we love art. And the paranormal and art are completely the same thing in some ways, including the artists. But here's the problem. We have no theory of the imagination that can take art seriously. We dismiss the imagined into the imaginary. And that's why the sciences, get to be the sciences and the art buildings on the other side of campus, essentially. So I think what we need is a new theory of the imagination to take art much, much more seriously.
Well, just to say one thing, like there's a huge political and art kind of thing going on now. I mean, everyone recognizes that, art has a lot to say. It speaks for marginalized communities in political contexts, and it's very, so much associated with radical politics. And it's kind of a direction that I could easily see the impossible, going in, because it serves the same kind of purposes.
I don't know if you noticed, Petra. I hope you'll be here when I give my presentation, because the title of my presentation is Mathematicians and Artists. And what I found when my book was published was that I received so much. I received art. I received pottery. I received poems. I received so much art. And I also received a lot of correspondence from mathematicians. And strangely, I thought, what do these people have in common? And I figured it out. There's a Venn diagram, and artists and mathematicians are like this. Okay, so there is an intersection where they have a lot in common. And I'm going to talk about that tonight, and I find it exciting. So what a wonderful question. Let's see. Shall we go? I'm sorry, thank you.
2 or 3 more.
Yeah.
We're at about noon.
Okay.
So I have a real practical question. I kind of want to make the impossible possible. I think everybody's on first base with ET experiences in general. It's been going on for hundreds of years, actually. There's even stuff in the Vedic texts about this if you watch Giorgio every once in a while. So I have been an applied physicist in the oil business for about almost 50 years. And I just want to preface this just a little bit. My experiences have involved experiences for 60 years, and just in the last 5 years, direct contactee. Okay, so with my son, and I'll just leave it at that. Some of you might not be able to get on first base with it. But my question specifically is, one of the big problems that we're having with disclosure, which is what we're doing right here, is the organized religions on the planet. This is going to be a serious impediment. So I'm just going to throw it out to the entire group. What can Catholicism do to bring some of the Old Testament back into play, like Enoch, etc.? What can Islam do? Maybe it needs a whole nother New Testament. And what can Buddhism do, who are very passive, been sitting on their hands for a long time, and yet telling us the exact thing that we're all wondering about here, about mysticism and higher dimensional aspects of thinking. So I'm just going to put that out there, and that you may not have a question for that, but I do believe it'll help some religious studies students get jobs, because there is a very practical aspect to this. Our entire civilization is in a period of ascension. I'm told that all the time, and we are all going to be raising our frequency, even if we don't fully understand the math. I can do tensor math with spatial problems. I do not know how to do tensor math with three-dimensional time, right? That is a problem. They do, and they have predicted everything that is happening right now. And so as a whole, be happy, because those time predictions are very positive for us, but we have to meet certain metrics. We have to pull ourselves up by the bootstraps and do some things. They will not take Putin off the map, for example. We have to do that ourselves. So the question is very practical, a nuts and bolts thing. The philosophy is wonderful. We've been thinking about it for a long time. We've been writing it. I have not written a book, but between my son and I probably could write one that'd be very applicable. So where do we go from here? What can be done with Roman Catholic Church? And there's a lot of stuff under the Vatican and St. Peter's that everybody would love to see. What can be done with Islam? What can be done with Buddhism in a very proactive way to move this forward, with that assumption that this is a huge process of disclosure, and it needs to move faster. They tell me that all the time. We have a limited amount of time to do this.
Panelists?
I think of religion as a toolkit, right? It's a bag of stuff. And when people have a problem, they reach into the bag and they look for something that can help, right? So if the aliens landed tomorrow, right, this would be a major crisis for world religions. The question is, what tool would they pull out of their bag? And something I always try to emphasize to my students is religion is not this horrible bane on the planet, and it's also not always a good thing. It's both, right? And if you don't see both those at once, I didn't train you well, right? I have noticed that, and you have lots of examples in Christianity of sort of positive attitudes about the possibility of extraterrestrials. The Space Trilogy by C.S. Lewis is a really kind of interesting theological thought experiment on that. But one thing I've noticed is the Christians who have the most to say, who write the most books about the UFO phenomenon, tend to be very conservative and demonological. Right, and we watched this documentary, and it's quoting Jacques Vallée, and it's quoting J. Allen Hynek, and then it shifts to, and so what this has proven is these creatures are all biblical demons, right? And they're telling us they're aliens because they want us to believe in evolution and the Big Bang, right? So this all proves our sort of reactionary approach. So. That's potentially a problem, right, for thinking about the kinds of questions that you asked. But again, I think that there's both problems and solutions when we're looking at any of these religious traditions.
Okay, I think we have one more question, and then I think we'll end the session.
Thanks. I'll try to keep this tight. And by the way, Wendy, I think that most philosophy majors probably go to law school. So thinking back to yesterday's panel, I thought it was interesting that at least two of the panelists had legal training. And it got me thinking about the ethics of practicing parapsychology, remote viewing in particular, and ethical codes, as well as societal principles like informed consent, conduct, transparency, and privacy, confidentiality, et cetera. And incidentally, human societal principles versus apparent cosmic ones. Annie Jacobson writes rather conventionally as a journalist, as a more of a non-participant observer in her books on the government's remote viewing program, Project Paperclip and on DARPA. But there are certainly suggestions of highly unethical conduct of her subjects and their projects. And Jacobson elaborates a lot more on this in her interviews, especially about the particular context of national security concerns in this case. But conversely, something that struck me about your book, American Cosmic, Diana, was how you mention explicitly ethics and ethical codes of some of your subjects and comment on belief systems. And I'm wondering if you can speak more about your writing a nonfiction book for a university press when you were part of the narrative you were writing. And then I guess more broadly to the panel, what do you think religious studies and the humanities should have to say about ethics and ethical codes, both concerning these subjects in your writing and teaching, but also about the societal implications of something like apparent abductions, or even something like the CIA's apparent staging of alien abductions in Brazil that Valet wrote about. So yes, I know that's a pretty big question, but yeah, maybe ethics is something we can bring up later in the conference.
That's
Do you want to go
definitely
first?
you.
Okay, I'll go. Okay, so this is a touchy subject, but I absolutely brought that up in the American Cosmic, which I wrote a few years ago, and had the experience of bringing together communities of scientists who studied UFOs in secret with academics. And I recognized that our communities were so entirely different, we probably could never have a conversation, because one had to be secret about their sources or die or something. And then us, we were like, well, we have to show our sources. So immediately I was struck by this, and I was quite naive at that point. Now, after many years of being involved in this research and in removing the brackets and being immersed in something that changed my epistemologies, and okay, so I would say that when I give my presentation, I'm going to call for an ethics for us in the academy, because we have to have that, especially when we're dealing with this topic now. I felt that from Jacques Vallée's talk, where he's telling us about truth, and and I think that this is something that I'm going to be talking about, that I'm going to be calling us the visible college, because that's what we are. We're visible. We're going to share our sources. I had to write, I had to use pseudonyms for two of the people in the book, but now I don't. Okay, so one of those persons has come out as Dr. Gary Nolan, thankfully, and now I can talk. He's James in my book, but we're dealing with something that does have implications for national security. So taking the brackets off in this respect was, it became frightening. But I think that I've worked out a way to deal with that. But that's what I have to say about that. I can't say more later.
And I guess I would say that a lot of this, I think about these questions a lot in my own work, since I am working in a politically charged area of China. And I think that this is where the importance of the human element, I think that's really something that's really an important aspect of the impossible, is the human element. And that the people I talk to, my Tibetan friends, my Chinese friends who are sympathetic to the Tibetans, what they are doing, that the humanity of the Tibetans is more important than any knowledge that can be gained. And so if I'm going to publish something and it's going to put anyone I know at risk, I should not publish it. That their humanity and their life is more important than any extra line on my CV.
Yeah, and we won't publish anything that reveals sources. If it's at all questionable, we have an attorney look at it. Extensive revisions are made. Whole scenes are put in different cities.
Yeah.
Well, and even if I was a sociopath and didn't care about ethics, which I do, you can't do this research without trust, right? Once you've lost the relationship of trust with the cultures that you're trying to study, it's over. That's the end of your research. And so for no other reason, we have to remember that.
And I just to close, I would just say, one of the first rules, I think, of religious studies that we learn is that the religious is not the moral. You know, there's a dark side to religion, and there's a bright side. There's a negative sacred, there's a positive sacred. And human beings have been using these abilities for millennia to harm each other and to hunt and to seduce. And a lot of this stuff is done, is experienced passively. You know, people don't choose this. It's done to them. And so I think that's internal to the phenomenon. So I think there are profound ethical issues there, but I don't think we should confuse the ethical with the phenomenon itself. It's operating on an entirely different level.
Thank you, panelists, and thank you, audience.